All right, so this is going to be a little bit different than some of the other videos. This is more presentational. This one's about project process. So some of the things I picked over the years and as collaborating with other designers and developers on projects, kind of narrowed it down to a process that allows me to streamline from concept to product and getting it into market. So with this, I'm going to be going over this process that I've kind of come up with over the years, and then I'm going to show you some examples at the end. So this is part of my Nicetransition series, so these videos are meant for designers, developers, or anyone really looking to get into this industry. So the first thing here is about your team, because for a product to be created, unless you're really by yourself and you're multi-talented, most of the time you're working with a team or collaborating one way or another. So this is kind of an overview of how a team should work, and it's breaking down all the main pieces of what makes up a team. And this is looking at almost the different verticals, but if you think of it as a pie, that everyone has an equal part and everyone has an equal share, it's a great way of thinking about it. So the content writers, so what are we making? We're trying to provide data, we're trying to provide content to consumers and users of our applications and projects that we're making. The user experience, the design, or the experience of it, like how people are interacting with it, how you're serving up that data, how you're engaging with them. The design side of it, how it looks, feels. The front end being more on the UI side, the actual pieces that you're interacting with. So even if it's a native application, front end kind of it's bucketed in there. So the designing inside of Xcode or whatever you may be doing. And then the back end, the services that are inside. But the important thing is that the team should be working together and everyone has an equal share in collaborating with each other. And that's what this process is really all about. And to kind of take a few steps back, looking at the traditional kind of triangle of what makes up a project. So we have the timeline, scope, and budget. And these things kind of shift and change, and we're always hearing this when we're developing something like, how long's the timeline? How much of the scope? Well, if the timeline's really short, we'll probably have to reduce the scope. If the budget is increased, maybe we can increase the scope because we can add more people to it, or increase the timeline. But these are the main things with a project. But the important thing that I've learned is when it comes to any of these things, it's about setting priorities. So the different pieces and parts that make up the project, prioritizing them as a team, and not just because one person wants it, but it's about trying to get that product to market and what really needs to be there for the first product that's going to market or that next version that you're aiming towards. And then with that, making sure that you have something that's out there that you can iterate. And with this, I worked in companies where we sold Agile and Scrum as a deliverable and a capability. But a lot of times what we ended up doing was just talking about the project. We never actually made anything with it. And for us, like we were iterating, but it was always trying to get, that product in market based off Scrum. And really what happened was the process became really our project. And a lot of times we didn't get that many things to market. Over my career, I've launched a lot of projects from a wide range of different industries. And with that, I've been very successful on making sure that we have something that has been prioritized with the scope, looking at the timeline, making sure we're conscious of the budget, and not just money budget, but the time that's spent from the individuals and focusing on the areas of where they need to be putting their attention to. So the big call out is don't let the process become your project, but think about how you can collaborate and aiming towards the final deliverable. And that's where this concept of linear development comes from. So again, I show this pie chart in the equal parts of content, UX, backend, front end, and design. With that, these are all the same pieces that make up what a project is. So looking at what linear development is, it's going from the start of the project to the finish of the project. But what you're really looking at is just one deliverable and what you're aiming to build out. So as you have your team members, you're always talking about what are we actually doing at the end. A lot of times in projects, there's pieces and parts that are handoffs. They're more like tasks that become throwaway. A really good, bad example of this is the wireframes that you have. So say you build wireframes, you show that to the client reviews it, and then it immediately goes into the design and the wireframes are kind of thrown away. Sometimes the requirements are treated the same way and you're not constantly thinking about the next product. It's like the BA is done with it, the UX, the information architect's done with it, the research is done with it, and now we moved on and next piece of the project is handed up. Even though you may say you're working in an agile environment, you still have these steps that are there. What this is aiming towards is just having one deliverable and all the pieces are actually happening in parallel. So looking at the different roles here, so the UX side of it, the user experience side, is outlining the experience, and they're doing it based off of their research, as well as usability, so heuristics that have existed since the beginning of the web and the ever-changing web, looking at the trends that are happening and making sure that you're building something that people want to use and aligns to how they expect it to use. So they're not opening up the application or the website and trying to learn how to use it from day one. It's based off of how other things have worked in the past. And really more importantly, it's looking at also how your customers, how your users are going to be using your product, and the prioritization of the scope and the features and functions that you have are based around the people that will actually be using it. The next piece here is the design side. So the design is creating the visuals, probably the most obvious thing. But where I like to really call out is it's around the technology and the user experience. So you're designing around the capabilities and or the limitations of the system. So basically, a lot of times projects go from the wireframes, and maybe you're bringing some technologists earlier on, but they're not as involved with it. And then it gets to the design piece, and you make these really nice designs, and then you're going to integrate maybe into a platform that is very restrictive. And you make this design around this platform, but you don't have a lot of actual wiggle room when you get to the front end or the back end piece to bring these designs to life. So then the design that was approved by the client, when they actually see the final product of it, once it's been integrated into a platform, a content management system, or some kind of framework that you may have to be handcuffed to, it will probably have to design or probably have to evolve, change, or not actually be what you expect the design to be. So designing around the limitations and the capabilities of the systems that you're building it for are really, really important. And then also around the user experience. So making sure that the UX side, the research, and all those important pieces in the beginning, the information architecture, is an evolution of what the product will be. And it's not necessarily a stepping stone. Again, it's happening all parallel. Which the front end piece is about creating the interface. So it's taking the design and bringing it to life, and more importantly, around the various contexts. So when we started doing a lot of responsive web designs, we would say there was a mobile first type of strategy where you design for mobile. This is the most limiting. And then you would build up for desktop, and then you would also build up tablet and all these different phone sizes. You had all these different markups. But the issue with that is when you're designing it, a more mature, experienced designer responsive can probably do that. And I know there's some tools out there, but a lot of them don't actually align to how coding works. The front end is actually a better way of doing that because you can actually make these living design pieces that can change flux and adapt to the screen sizes, and you can create every modification for the various contexts and user types that are out there, such as different gestures, such as motion, such as voice, and all these different things. So making sure that you're actually designing it in the platform that you are. So that's what I mean by the different contexts. So I put a lot of the front end pieces, the UI, aligned directly with the design, but it's the evolution of the design. And this will make sense when I get to the example at the end. The last piece is really the back end, and this is probably the most important piece. This is sometimes the most restrictive and can be the most expensive. But this is actually bringing the product to life and connecting all these pieces together. A lot of times, even in an agile environment, this is where the true development actually starts happening, and everything gets dumped on the back-end developers to bring it to life. And they're connecting the data into the application, to the systems, infrastructures that you may have at your organization or the product that you're building, web services, the APIs that you're building. And this is where a lot of things come up where it's like, we can't actually do that. And that can be a problem because this is the actual product, is bringing it all together and serving it up to your customers. The idea behind linear development is to really define and refine the project as it progresses. And every one of those like pie chart or that pie graph is working together and bringing their own expertise and letting the right experts lead their craft at the right time, and everyone having an equal distribution of not just the deliverables, but input from start to finish and aiming towards that one deliverable. And I said this earlier, but stressing this one more time is that all the pieces are happening in parallel. So this is not necessarily saying linear development as in handoffs inside of it, but this is saying linear development as we are from start to finish aiming towards one deliverable, and all these things are happening together. Which is going to get me into one of my examples. So this is building a solution for a website that recently worked on for Bundy Baking Solutions, who's an awesome client, awesome business. They are the makers of pans for amazing companies, a lot of the pizza places that you use, Twinkies made on it. They are magical when it comes to baking solutions. They're a great company and they're Ohio-based. A lot of you have probably interacted with them and you never even knew that they existed. So this project started off with research and strategy ahead of time. So a full audit from start to finish, and the audit also included technology, recommendations from SEO, as well as from usability, heuristics, and accessibility. And we also looked at the design, but more importantly, we looked at the content, because that's why people are coming to this website. It's what their customers are using. What content do we need to bubble up, and how was it being served originally, and how could it be better served? So we came up with a navigation strategy for all the different products and how you could get from some of the most detailed pages to some of the high-level landing pages. So it's a large website with a lot of content, a lot of different products. We needed a way to do it. Next was the wireframe. And this looks like a typical wireframe, but I'll explain how this is different in the next slide. So looking up closely here, you see this is taking the content from the research side and then from knowing the current website and prioritizing it based off the research that we had with their stakeholders as well as customers for why people are coming to the site. And then making sure that would align to the content management system that we're building in, which was in WordPress. And then looking at the overall structure for it and how you could have some high-level callouts in the beginning. Next was the design side, and this is what the design looks like. Now, so far, it sounds like I'm just talking about doing research, and then we immediately went to wireframes, and we went to design. The difference with how this was built was this was built in Sketch. So we actually took our wireframes and took the same files, and we started updating the individual pieces of it. So this design, this wireframe actually was the first iteration of the design based around the content and limitations of the system. So we had these pieces, and then in Sketch you have what are called smart objects, or symbols, and you can take those symbols like this button here that says find a local rep and add a design to it, and then it will cascade throughout your entire Sketch file. So you have this wireframe that isn't throwaway, it becomes a step in the process in the evolution of the design. So at the same time while that was happening, literally we were building out a branding style guide, a digital style guide for them called an element collage. An element collage is a breakdown of all the core components kind of broken away from the design and outlining what they are. So things like color, typography rules, some of the form elements, the anchors, the hover states, the active states, all these variations of it, and coming up with a system that they could be easily used. These pieces are the pieces that also lived in the Sketch file that became the button that replaced that evolved to this. So again, as the wireframes were happening, at the exact same time, we were going through and creating an element collage without even knowing the design or having the wireframes, because we were bringing the brand to life in the digital format and then marrying them together. Cool thing also about that is if we made maybe an assumption or we didn't like our element collage at the beginning with these individual pieces, we could always update it and tag it, so even if a header changed, it would cascade throughout our entire project. Looking at this a little bit closely, this is a concept, and I've done another video on this. I've talked about this a lot at different conferences. I have this up on my CodePen. I'm Nicetransition on CodePen. But this is a methodology that my buddy Tim Vonderlo and I came up with about colors. And what we said was every interface or every brand typically has a primary color and a secondary color. Sometimes they have a tertiary color, but they have a primary color, secondary color, they have a dark color, they have a light color, and they have an accent color. Which seems like a lot of colors to say that in a traditional brand you have 5 core colors. But when you're building out an interface, you have a lot of variations inside of it. And that's where we came up with this concept that there were 20 colors and up to 24 if you have a tertiary color. But with this, it's for a primary color, you would have something like a primary dark, primary light, the primary itself, the primary accent. And then for secondary, you have secondary dark, light, accent, dark, 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 light, dark accent, and so forth. So now you have 20 colors that you don't need to start thinking about the colors of what what color should I use for this accent piece? What color should I use for this underline, this hover state? You have them identified here. The other really cool thing here is that this becomes a good way for designers and developers to communicate with each other. You can give these, you can associate a hex color or an RGBA color, RGB color to a name. So instead of calling it the B79562 or the golden dark color, we can say use the secondary color. and it becomes an easy way for us to communicate back and forth. So if a developer or the UI designer developer uses the wrong color, and the more art director or creative director or designer on it, it's like, you're using the wrong color. And it's like, oh, I thought I was using the right one. They could say you're using secondary dark as opposed to secondary. The other cool thing is these can be the same way that you set up if you're using Sass, your Sass variables, as well as creating helper classes for your colors. So the library that I wrote, UI Arc, actually has this built into it where you have these primary colors, secondary colors, dark, light, and accent colors. And that becomes a way that you associate helper classes to change background color as well as colors of text, as well as the variables inside your project. It becomes a common language for you to communicate. The other thing is for every one of the colors, it has its contrasting, the contrast ratio for each of those colors. So colors that will pass the Web Content Accessibility Guideline for color ratios is also built in. That's why the text on it is one color. It's so it can pass those guidelines. The other cool thing with this is by using this naming convention as opposed to like semantic naming like gold, red, blue, off green, teal, white, black, is if we want to change our secondary color across the site, say Bundy went from having this blue gold color to maybe red and blue, we can just replace the hex values inside of our Sass project and it'll cascade through the project. And we don't have to go through our code and update the names, the helper classes or CSS classes inside the project. So an easy way for us to kind of cascade through and also communicate back and forth. The next piece here is the typography rules. So every interface has 1 to 2 fonts. Now the crazy thing about web fonts, how they work is if you have a font, you probably want a bold version of it, a normal version of it, and a light version of it. And then if you have a secondary font, you want the same thing. So with that and how web fonts work is you actually have 6 fonts that are being downloaded. So each way is considered a different font. The more fonts that you add, the bigger the download. So that's why the recommendation that I have is to have up to 2 fonts and these different weights inside of it. Now you probably have your own brand that may need something different, and that's completely fine, but this is a good way of starting it. Other thing is we identify the H1s through H6s. And this is part of a methodology that I wrote that's called object-oriented typography that's also on my CodePen. I also did a video about this about 2 years ago. But it's this idea of saying H1 is your largest font size and H6 is your smallest font size. So in the interface, you should only have really 6 different sizes. So when you're designing it, you can get over that designer error of like, should it be 10 pixels or 12 pixels? It's like, no, it's the H6. And the same thing can be applied to helper classes and the fonts that, sizes that we're using. So it becomes consistency from small sizes to large sizes and a way to identify. So we identify H1s through H6s, or size 1 being the largest and size 6 being the smallest. The next piece is the identification of page headers, subheaders, section subheaders, article subheaders, and paragraph headers. So what these are the main blocks and headers that you have in your site. The big thing that I call out here is there's a separation from the actual HTML element that you're using versus the design. So when it comes to the coding aspect of this, these are all just helper classes that are component classes that you're adding to an element. So I could add the page header class to an H6 because it will give me that look of the bigger font because maybe I need it. But in reality, the bots and the way that the browsers and things going out there and accessibility is reading my page, that H6 is being used because it's not a high importance content, but visually maybe it's related to something that we want to show. So it's a separation of the context, the content, and the visual of it, and the skin and structure of it, making sure that you're using the right classes for styles, but then using the right HTML elements for the content so it can actually be read by bots. So all the interfaces have these. Building them out and having them there from the beginning gives you this really nice setup, and then you throw in the buttons and some of the form fields and the hover states of stuff, you pretty much have a great start to your interface. As I said, this is being built out at the same time that the wireframes are being built out, and then we're replacing those symbols inside of Sketch. You can also do the same thing in Photoshop, and with that, they cascade through. These are also deliverables that we're showing to our client at various times, but making sure that they're aligned to it and the branding aligns to their branding needs and their marketing department. As that's also happening, we are building out the actual HTML. So as the element collage is being evolved and we're adding these colors, we're actually building out the same pieces in HTML and CSS. And that's happening inside of this framework that I have here. So this is actually using Fabricator, which is another open source project. And with that, it's using UIArc, the framework that I have, which is a skinless UI library. It's about structures, but then it has a brand layer and an application layer that you can start adding styles in. So from there, as those things are being designed in the element collage that are going to be also the deliverable of the evolution of the wireframes, I'm also building the exact same thing inside of code, and the structure here becomes a way that I'm starting the front end pieces. And the reason why the design is happening, and this is also happening at the same time, is I don't want to just start in the browser right now, especially in the first iteration with a client, because there may be something that they want to change in the design. And it is a little bit quicker to do design changes in Sketch in the early stage, but as the project evolves, it becomes way quicker just to do it in the browser. So it still kind of follows that same thing. But the important thing is the front end is actually happening and those base components are being built out. And then we're using the element collage as kind of the blueprints for it. And if anything adapts or changes, we're having to update the code for it. But the element collage becomes a way to evolve the wireframes. And from there, you can start building out pages and pieces like this. At the same time that we're doing the research, we're also writing user stories, and this is part of the research side. But these user stories are also identifying what needs to be inside the wireframes and the design and the components that we're going to be building. So we're going to be starting to index components from the previous site if it exists, or identifying what the interactions are from the user experience side and starting to build those out in the framework as well as in the element collage. But more importantly, thinking about the different ways people are going to be using this. So as a user, I want to select blah, 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 and then thinking about not just the customer experience, but then the people also managing, maintaining it from the content management side. So as an administrator, as an admin, I want to have this. We want to make sure that, again, we're building around those limitations, the capabilities of the system, and we're identifying the pieces that have to be there. We're also identifying those pieces, I said, by indexing them. So light overview of what the layout should be, and what are the requirements of that section. So what are the core components that are going to make this interaction so I can get from one space to another, or actually identify the content, the priority there. And then we have references of them to the design that may switch out. So for presentational purposes, this showed a more involved version of it, but it's most likely going to be the wireframe. And then each of these components have their own story that's related to a task that we're watching and has greater description if needed and how they're going to be interacting it. And that becomes kind of the handoff card from front end to experience side to design as well as content. So as that's also happening, we're not waiting to the end to get the back end started. We're starting to add the components and pieces inside of WordPress. So this is the WordPress instance and all the different fields that we'll need that will then be married to the output page. So as the front end starting to build out the pieces from the element collage, the designer's building out the evolving wireframes, prioritizing the content. Research side is bringing in, making sure that it's aligning to heuristics. Content side can actually start writing content inside here. So one of the big things is a lot of times you're designing for those perfect scenarios. But by adding content in your system ahead of time and also building everything out at the same time, you can identify the content and make sure that your design is flexible to meet the needs, both minimum, maximum character requirements for real content that's happening. And the content providers are actually the people that are going to, why people are coming to your site is to read the content, so start adding it in there. So then the backend side's also just taking these fields and putting them inside. So you have a clickable almost prototype of what your site is going to be, and it's aligned to the backend system. So this is showing early stages of the site and the navigation that was being added in there and how you can manage and maintain it. It also becomes a way to start training your clients and the people that are going to be the admins on your project ahead of time. So you're not just handing them a big project at the end that identifies like you have to learn X, Y, and Z. They can start adding content and getting familiar with it, and you can start seeing it inside here. But again, we can start identifying limitations and capabilities, and more importantly, how we're going to manage that content, and then if there's going to be any restrictions inside of it. Everything for this was custom application development. We just used WordPress as the framework for the content management system. So then we get here, and we take the UI, and we start marrying it inside of the the design. So all these pieces are happening at the same time. You may have a component that's actually built out really nice, that's like on a page like this, and a module that is completed that has a full UI. Typically we do the Chrome first, so header, the main content constraints, the variations of wide width, full width, and how it will cascade from small screens to large screens, the footer, and we start building out the individual modules and the content and relating it directly to the WordPress content and putting it out there. You get it all married together and it looks something like this. So search works, navigation works, and it starts iterating and evolving. The good thing is if something takes longer, you can pull that feature out or have a design change without anyone ever really knowing that that happened. So because the team's working together and all of them are happening together, you can evolve together. So this page is looking down at all these things that were actually happening at the same time, and all the different team members are working together for this final deliverable of BundyBakingSolutions.com. Now, the second example I'm going to give here, and this is a work in progress, and we've been moving really, really quick. So this is more about showing an evolution of a project and why this is also impactful and helpful. So this is a rewrite of the BYBE app. So BYBE initially was written in React Native, and now it's being written as React.js and using PhoneGap as a wrapper. So this will allow us to actually create two different products inside here, which is going to be our white label version of the BYBE app, which will be able to be skinned and customized for different retailers to use. But it's also going to allow us to have a web version of the app, as well as an iOS and Android version, and then anyone that's using the white label version can also do that. And it's all managing from one overview, which I'll show on a later slide. So with this process, it's only about 2 weeks inside of development, but we're about 90-some% done, and all the pieces are happening together, and we're working around the limitations and capabilities of it. So this is kind of a quicker and more, focus on what I was talking about, writing out the DOM and that layout structure that I had. So here we started with just like the Chrome of the container, header, footer, and those were kind of built out. But then the different sections and modules inside of it, we put the right HTML elements inside of it, but we didn't start styling it. So it was just core blank HTML. And what that allowed us to do was start looking at submodules and the different components that we're going to be building inside the React.js and finding reusable components from one screen to another, but more importantly, how we're going to get from one screen to another. Another thing is in comments, we're writing requirements about what things should do. And if there's something that iterates through, it can do it. So this is like the login screen. Again, no classes are really being added inside the main content area. And what this will allow you to do is actually interact with the React.js side. We start bringing in our web services inside here, as well as like authentication and all these pieces and the security that's being built in there. But it doesn't have the styles yet. But as a piece is all built together from the back end, we can also start identifying the UI and building it at the exact same time. This is a closer look at that field. So as I said, like I would write requirements here. So it says, if authenticated user should never see the screen. So different callouts like that, and how the remember me should look, and some of the rules around it. So it's all in one place, and everyone knows what it is, and we're all kind of working from the same files. Here is the offer screen, and this has a little bit more rules inside of it, but you can see that the HTML is very basic, and it doesn't really have much here. It's just core HTML elements, and then some of the conditionals that need to be in there, and how loops will work, and what is actually going to be looping, so then we can identify those components and what lives inside of another piece. So React.js can be happening, front end can be happening at the same time, and design can be happening at the same time. So again, we use the same framework here, added the styles and the branding inside of it, and then those start getting trickled into those light pages, which are the linear design pages, and we create something that looks like this, which is the evolution of it. And some of this has changed actually pretty dramatically. We had a hack night last night until 2 in the morning, so we switched things around, built out new components. I've been trying to share these on my Instagram, which is Nicetransition, and we've been doing a lot of open source projects through my GitHub, Nicetransition, and kind of sharing the process that has been the evolution of this project. And then looking at this screen, so desktop to mobile and how that looks, and if we need to change something, how that would look. If a title, so that orange at the top, is too long, what does it look like? Does it break things on this side? The pop-up, as actually on this one, was initially an expand, so it was like an accordion, but what that did was it broke the interface. It kind of haphazardly made everything kind of jump around. So now on desktop, when you click on product and product details, it actually has a CSS lightbox that pops up on top of it, so a box that goes on the forefront. But then on mobile, when you click on it, it acts as an accordion. So those are things that like we didn't necessarily think about when we were planning it out, but as the evolution and the design happened, the experience, we're like, this is what makes sense for the various contexts of a user interacting with it. So as that's happening, we're also setting up the PhoneGap app and identifying the different pieces. So PhoneGap's really great because you can take control of native capabilities. Like we have a camera upload functionality. If we want to do push notifications, we can do that. Both those are actually available in the browser, but they are using the browser to take advantage or utilize the hardware that you have on your system, where PhoneGap is a direct access to those hardware that you as an app builder, when you compile an iOS and Android, put on the App Store and Google Play, that the user knows that you're having access to those, or they authenticate it. So it gives you a little bit of a smoother feel in the native app, but the web app is almost one-for-one. But we have to make sure that we're building out the JS to have conditionals, so when it compiles for the web, it knows that this is the web version using ES6, and Babel to backtrack for older browser support and legacy browsers, and then for PhoneGap, utilizing the correct methods and directives that are needed to build it out and call the native pieces. So we're doing that at the same time and making sure that the web version and the PhoneGap version are happening at the same time. So then we're also then bringing in the data from our web services and starting to build this out and looking at conditional things and changing around and making sure that the functionality of this application and the conditions are being met. So the backend is written in Rails, and the app itself, so the web services are in Rails, but the app is a single page HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we have to write all the security as a freestanding app. So you don't need necessarily a backend to do it. You can plop it on a .NET, you can put it on a PHP, you can put it on a Rails server, but our servers and the communication, our middleman layer, is actually written in Rails, as well as our API that we're pulling in to control all this. We're using a lot of the different AWS services, anything that you can imagine. I'm a hardcore AWS user at this point. I love AWS, but it's the most confusing thing ever. But it's very, very helpful for getting us what we need. We're using Git to manage and maintain our project and making sure that we're all communicating and working directly with each other. And then lastly, this is kind of the architecture of everything. So we have the BYBE API inside here, the backend middle piece, we have the web piece. The web UI is actually being used in the PhoneGap app, and then we're also planning for the next version and the previous version after this, which is going to be a direct connection into retailer CRMs, as well as their POS system for single sign-on, and then also for us to have transactional information and data that we're sharing back to retailers. So this is kind of the architecture of everything, but the important thing is that we're building the UI, the design, the PhoneGap app, as well as the backend services and the middleman layer, and making sure that it's all connected and it's all happening, and it's happening really, really quick. So summary of this is, as a team, we set a goal and we identify what that is, and setting the priorities, which is another one here. Identifying the team and the right people, so bringing the right people in the right project at the right time, but making sure that everyone knows their roles and responsibilities for the project. Aligning to the process, the way that you're communicating also from one way or another, whether it's text message, Slack, email. If you're all in the same room together, that's great. A lot of times you can't actually afford that, but if you can, making sure that you're all aligned on the process. Prioritizing the pieces from scope, timeline, and budget, and understanding what it is, but getting a spot where you can iterate and letting the experts lead their craft at the right time. So as I said, that this was a little bit of a different video. This is kind of an overview of what process that I've been using over the years and how I've been able to get various products in different industries to market. And I hope these two examples help bring it together from a web content management system to a hybrid application that's a very sophisticated back-end service related to it. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions that people will have. I'm Nicetransition on Twitter. So please reach out to me there, leave comments in the YouTube video, and I'll respond as quickly as possible. And if you have any suggestions on future topics, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'm doing all these videos for people to watch like yourself, and I'm more than willing to share my experience and knowledge from a design development standpoint, or bring in any experts that may know something better than me and record a video. So please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I loved sharing this stuff. I love talking about it. And I hope you found this helpful and you try it in one of your future projects. Thank you.